Hello everyone and welcome back to part 4 of the card draw series. This one will be about swarm draw. Basically what this means is you draw for each creature you have on board. So kind of like how Gaia's Cradle gives you 1 green mana for each creature that you have in play, this one draws you a card for each creature that you have in play. So that's the quickest, easiest way to explain it. If you're wondering what I mean by swarm draw, you just draw per creature. There are about a dozen cards on this list, and they go into pretty much any deck that just wants to have a bunch of creatures, whether it be things that you cast, so usually low-costing creatures so that you can just get a lot of them out, or token decks where, one spell or even like a permanent on the battlefield that recurringly creates tokens will just generate you a lot of bodies on the board, and then you can all at once draw 10, 20, 30 cards if you have that many bodies on board. So the decks that this goes into, a few examples that I thought of were like Karuga, the Macro Sage, 5 mana, including 2 of which have to be either green or blue, so the hybrid mana. He's a 5/4 Dinosaur Hippo. He has the companion ability, so you can have him as your companion if your starting deck contains only cards with CMC 3 or greater and land cards. And when he enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with CMC 3 or greater. So assuming that most of those permanents are creatures, this one would be non-tokens. You just draw that many cards. Next would be Tishana, Voice of Thunder, 7 mana, including a green and a blue. It's got double stars for the power toughness, and it's a Merfolk Shaman. Power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand. You have no maximum hand size, and when Tishana enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control. So she has an ETB effect that's based off of the number of creatures that you have. You can see that the next one is Risk the Redeemed. It only costs a single mana of either green or white. 1/1 Elf Warrior. He has 2 abilities. The first one is 3 mana, including 1 either green or white. Tap him, put a 1/1 green and white Elf Warrior token into play. And then the other ability costs 6 mana, 2 of which are hybrid green and white. Tap them. For each creature token you control, put a token into play that's a copy of that creature. So if you've ever seen this commander before, and there's a good chance you have, you know that he just doubles his creatures and doubles his creatures, and he really gets out of control fast. And that one is an example of the token-based strategy. And then the 4th commander that I thought would be appropriate is Nylea, Keen-Eyed, 4 mana, including a single green, 5/6 enchantment creature god. She has indestructible as long as your devotion to green is less than 5. Nylea isn't a creature. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and for 3 mana, including a single green, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it into your hand. Otherwise, you may put it into your graveyard, or you may leave it where it is. So with Nylea, you just want to cast lots and lots of creatures at a slight discount and swarm the board that way. So all of these decks kind of want you to have lots of creatures out, and if you have lots of creatures out anyway, then drawing a bunch of cards for whatever your board state is really going to help you out. So I guess one of the things to keep in mind is that with these kinds of card draws, it's important to cast all your creatures first, then you use this kind of card draw. There's other types where you need to hold back the creature cards in your hand, wait till you get those other card draw effects in first. So this one is pretty obvious. You want to have all the creatures on the battlefield before you start considering using your card draw. So let's start with Armorcraft Judge, 4 mana, including a single green, 3/3 Elf Artificer. When Armorcraft Judge enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. So this one is very specific to 1/1 counter decks, things that want a lot of creatures that you can just put 1/1 counters on through whatever specific effect. This card would not work just in any deck. It has to be a deck that has 1/1 counter synergies. Beyond that, I don't think there's really anything to say. Next is Collective Unconscious, 6 mana, including double green. And it's a sorcery that says draw a card for each creature you control. That pretty much sums up what this video is about, is a card that will draw you cards equal to the number of creatures you have. Fairly common, very popular, I should say, fairly, but it should probably see a lot more play. If you are playing a deck that does put a lot of creatures out, this should be part of your card draw package. And next will be Freyalise Llanowar's Fury, 5 mana, including double green. She starts with 3 loyalty. It's a planeswalker, Freyalise. First ability is a +2. Put a 1/1 green elf druid creature token onto the battlefield that can tap for a mana, green mana. -2, destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then -6, draw a card for each green creature you control. And Freyalise can be your commander. Most decks that people put this in will be elf decks. I do have a Freyalise deck of my own, and it is not elf at all. But the part of her that is card draw is going to be the ultimate. Obviously, the +2 is just a token generator, and it gives you a mana dork, so you can ramp a little bit. The -2 is just a little bit of control if you happen to need to blow up an artifact or enchantment. But the fact that you have to, as a planeswalker, you have to uptick her, then uptick her again, then you can ult. So it takes you a little while to get the card draw. So if you were thinking of putting this in your deck, just know that you might not want to consider this a full card draw slot just because you don't get it immediately, which means there's a good chance you won't get it at all. It'd probably be best served as just supplementary. If you want an 11th card draw, or if you want her for her other 2 abilities and she just happens to add a little bit of potential card draw to your deck. But don't rely on the idea of drawing cards 3 turns after the fact. Next is Grim Flowering, 6 mana, including a single green. This is a sorcery, and this one says draw a card for each creature card in your graveyard. So this one is kind of the opposite of all the other cards on this list, which also makes it very worthwhile to include it on this list. If for whatever reason you've milled yourself or your opponents have milled you, that can kind of help you out. But I think that the main reason that you would want this is after any kind of board wipe, you can regenerate basically your hand by just getting extra cards out of that. So it kind of protects you from board wipes in a certain way after the fact. So there are a variety of cards that I can think of, not card draw related, that will kind of not necessarily dissuade a board wipe, but even if one happens, you'll get something out of it and it won't hurt you as bad, or you might even come out ahead depending on the scenario. This one should probably be considered a little bit more often than it does. It doesn't follow my personal style, but it could be fun depending on what exactly it is you're going for, what your play group is like. So it's worth considering. Next is Inspiring Call, 3 mana, including a single green. This one's an instant, and it says draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So this one is combined card draw and like a heroic intervention type scenario. So this one will basically save you in the case of a board wipe and draw you cards. Or you could, if you're just desperate for cards and have plenty of creatures and it's your own turn, just cast it just for the card draw. Or you could use it to save your creatures and the card draw is incidental. But obviously, because it specifies it only works on creatures with 1/1 counters on it, you either need to have your commander have a 1/1 counter on it, and just this is a single target save your commander card, or you need your deck to be based around 1/1 counters, kind of like the Armorcraft Judge from before. So this card has the versatility of you could include it for either one of those 2 reasons, which means you have twice as much reason to include it in almost any deck, provided that either your commander has 1/1 counter on it or the rest of your deck overall cares about it. Next is one that, okay, Mouth Feed. It's 3 mana for the first half of it, including a single green. That's a sorcery that says create a 3/3 green hippo creature token. And then Feed is the second half of it, 4 mana, including a single green sorcery. It has Aftermath. That's the effect on split cards where it says this half of the split card can only be cast from the graveyard. And then its actual effect is draw a card for each creature you control with power 3 or greater. This is a card I have nothing but great things to say about. It should see way more play. If you're not doing a tribal deck, or where you specifically are trying to avoid the hippo, or if you are playing just all tiny creatures, then yeah, you wouldn't want it. But if you just have like an even mix of semi big creatures, definitely want this card. If you've got any kind of token type synergies, doubling seasons and the primal vigors and parallel lives and all that stuff, definitely want it for that. Both halves of it are actually pretty effective, but what I've found just to be a hidden value to it is if you've drawn too many cards from another source and you have to go to discard, this is a card you're happy to discard, because you get as much or more value from the graveyard half of it, the Aftermath part. And this is just a huge performer. It is a great card. It should see way more play. And it just isn't. I don't know what else to say besides this card is highly underrated. Next is going to be Pygmy Kavu. 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 1/2 Kavu. When it comes into play, draw a card for each black creature your opponents control. So this one cares about what your opponents have, which is kind of fun and interesting. You're not going to see very much of that. Literally, it's in very, very few decks overall. I can understand people's hesitance to play a creature that depends on what your opponents are doing, because it might not do anything. It might just be a dead card. But all I can think, and I feel that way myself in most cases, if you happen to know that other players where you are always playing black or doing a lot of black deck, then this should be a much more obvious include. And black is obviously a pretty common color in Magic. What makes it stand out, though, or rather one of the reasons to highly justify it, is the same reason that Josh Lee Kwai just a couple months ago said he loved Reap. That's the card that allows you to get a card back from your graveyard equal to the number of black permanents that a target opponent controls. So that one was black permanents, not just black creatures, so it applies to enchantments or planeswalkers or whatever. But that one was one opponent. This one is all opponents, so they balance out and you get some extra benefit there. As a creature itself, it could draw you cards when it enters if you have other card draw effects out. And if you have any kind of ETB synergies, then it's going to double up with those. And it's probably going to perform better than what you expect. This card should almost certainly see a lot of play, just like how Josh advocated for Reap as being something that people overlook because they just consciously think that the risk, the chance to whiff is overblown. The potential for it is, the average expectation is reasonable. The potential is huge. It's a good card that should see a lot more play. Next is a card that does see a ton of play, and it is something that most people are going to be familiar with. Regal Force, 7 mana, including triple green, for a 5/5 elemental. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each green creature you control. So this is one that is going to be very commonly known. It's kind of the poster child for a creature that ETBs and draws you a bunch of cards. This is one of the only ones that when it enters the battlefield and draws you cards, it could go in any deck. It does stand on its own. A lot of the other ETB draw cards are just like draw a single card, so by itself those creatures aren't very good. But this one draws you X cards, and it will usually be a pretty decent amount. Minimum 1 if you have no other creatures when he enters. But this one appropriately sees a lot of play, and if you're not playing them and you do have a creature heavy deck, you should probably consider it at the very least. Again, unless you're trying to hold tight to a specific tribe, like that's what I'll do with like an elf deck, for example. I don't want non-elves in that deck. If you have some reason like that to disclude this, sure. Otherwise, he's probably something to consider in almost any creature-based deck. Next is Slate of Ancestry, 4 mana. It's an artifact. And it costs 4 and tap it to discard your hand and draw a card for each creature you control. This one sees a good amount of play, and I think it'll often show up on like elf ball decks and stuff like that with a lot of small creatures where you're kind of flooding the board. And personally, I haven't included it. I think I own a copy or two, and I just haven't really seen a good reason to include it, aside from the fact that it'll cost 8 mana to do, and I don't really want to discard my hand in most cases because I'm not just drawing cards, but I probably have something in my hand that I also need. I just don't think that it's probably as good as what you're wanting in most cases, but it is definitely going to perform pretty well at most power levels, at most tables. Next, let's talk about Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. 3 mana, including double green. It's a Planeswalker, Nissa. Starts with 3 loyalty. She has a +1, put a 0/1 plant, green plant creature token onto the battlefield. A -2, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. It's a big +1/+1 counter synergies there. And then -7, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of lands you control. So this one is so much worse than Freyalise as far as being card draw, because she starts at 3 loyalty. You would have to uptick her 4 times to get to the ultimate. So you are a number of turns away, assuming she survives. So if you just want the extra bodies of the plant tokens, if you care about the 1/1 counters, if you've got, multiple doubling season type effects where you can get her to ultimate very quick or almost immediately, then you can benefit that way. But otherwise, if you're going to include her, don't include her under the impression that she'll draw you cards, because it won't happen. Next is Nature's Resurgence, 4 mana, including double green. It's a sorcery. It says each player draws a card for each creature card in his or her graveyard. So this one does have a group hug element because it affects all players. So you could definitely, decide that you want to pass on this, because most people don't want the symmetrical effects that will benefit your opponents as well, and this one does. If usually with symmetrical effects, you'll want to include them if you know that you will benefit more than your opponents. So if you intend on doing a lot of self-mill, if you're doing a lot of sacrifice stuff, like in a black-green type deck, then it's worth considering. But if you don't have a good reason, if you don't have a plan that this fits into, it's going to be not that good for you. Next is one of the most popular, Shamanic Revelation, 5 mana, including double green. It's a sorcery. Draw a card for each creature you control, and it has Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So this one is just strictly better than what we've already seen. It draws you a ton of cards, and it can also gain you some life, and at 5 mana, it is actually 1 mana cheaper than Collective Unconscious, because that was 6. This is a card that should see a ton of play if your deck has a lot of creatures in it. Don't shove it into something that only has, 10, 15 creature cards total. But this is something that, under the right circumstance, could draw you half your deck. So it is very powerful. It should definitely be one of the marquee cards of green card draw in a deck that wants a lot of creatures. So that's it for this episode. We will be back soon for episode 5.